The story of my relationship with my wife, 46F, goes back to the 1970s. My parents immigrated from Brazil to the United States in 1970 and met another Brazilian couple who had recently moved to Dallas. They became fast friends and opened a business together 2 years later. In 1973, the wife of that couple became pregnant at the same time as my own mother. I was born 4 days before my wife, and since our families had no extended relatives in the U.S., we became each other's family. Her mother used to babysit me while my mother worked, and since I was an only child and her sisters were born 8 years later, we were practically raised together. We were inseparable, as my mother used to say. Our families took vacations together, and we had barbecues every weekend. We even went to church together every Sunday. We were the best of friends. Our love story started when I asked her on a date at the young age of 13, and to my delight, she agreed. Despite our tender age, our relationship was beyond our years. We were each other's best friends, and our connection was undeniable. We attended the same college, and, as fate would have it, we fell deeper in love. In 1994, I knew she was the one, so I proposed, and the following year, we got married. After we graduated, she started her own business, and I joined our dad's company. We welcomed our first daughter in 1998, and soon after, we were blessed with 3 more beautiful daughters, who are now 20, and 18 years old. It was like a dream. We were so happy. We lived our best lives with high salaries and comfort, owning multiple properties, including some in Europe. We vacationed twice a year, and our love life was healthy with indulgence in each other's kinks. We professed our love for each other every single day and had love normally 3 times a week. It was as if we were living in a fairy tale. I began to notice a change in her this year. She was spending more time working and constantly glued to her phone. Our love life started to dwindle, and we found ourselves arguing about trivial matters that we never used to. She became distant, cold even. When I confronted her about it, she blamed stress, but something just didn't add up. Our daughters even picked up on the change, but we were at a loss as to what was causing it. Last week was when I finally realized that something was off with my wife. My brother-in-law's younger brother had attempted to commit ending just 5 days ago, and it came as a shock to everyone. He never seemed depressed or showed any signs of dark thoughts. My wife and I are very close to my brother-in-law's family, so we were all worried and saddened by the news. Fortunately, he didn't succeed in ending his own life, but it was a close call. My brother-in-law found him in the garage with the car on. Despite the relief that he was expected to make a full recovery, my wife's behavior was strange throughout the whole ordeal. She had constant mood swings and was crying all the time. We were all sad, but she seemed to be more affected than she should have been. 3 days ago, my brother-in-law finally revealed the truth to me. My wife and his younger brother, 17 years younger than me, had been having an affair for almost 11 months. It was shocking to hear that my own wife had betrayed me. As it turns out, last week he had tried to persuade my wife to leave me for him. However, my wife had ended their relationship, and this had driven him to commit an ending. I confronted my wife after hearing this bombshell, and to my utter surprise, she confessed everything. I mean, who wouldn't hope that it's all a lie, right? She burst into tears, sobbing about how she didn't know why she did it, calling it a midlife crisis, claiming that nothing was wrong with us and that she still loved me. I nearly had a panic attack, feeling overwhelmed and not knowing what to do. I grabbed some clothes, threw them in a bag, and stormed out of the house. My wife tried to stop me, but I ignored her, got into my car, and drove for nearly 8 hours straight. When I finally stopped, I realized I was in Memphis. Since that day, I've been staying in a hotel, trying to process everything. My phone has been ringing nonstop with calls and messages from my wife and her family, but I just can't bring myself to answer. To make matters worse, my daughters now know about the situation because my wife told them. I only spoke to my oldest daughter, letting her know that I'm safe, but don't want to talk to anyone. My phone has been ringing nonstop since I left, with over 100 missed calls and 1,000 plus unread messages from my wife and her family. My daughters are also reaching out, but I just can't find the strength to talk to them yet. I've already downed 2 bottles of wine and a bottle of whiskey, in the last 48 hours. Can't seem to stop crying. I'm just lost. I've known my wife since she was a day old. We even have a photo together when she was just 2 days old. Now every thought of her makes me want to hurl. Where did I go wrong? What the heck am I supposed to do now, a few days after? The past few days have been quite a ride. I made the decision to sober up and head back to Dallas on the 23rd, but I wasn't in the best mental state to drive, so I ended up hiring a driver. When I got home, I avoided everyone except my daughters and dogs. I asked my youngest, Emily, to let my wife know that I didn't want to see her, and she ended up staying with her parents. Just so you know, I'll refer to my daughters by name: Sarah, Amanda, Amelia, and Emily. As a young dad, my daughters were my constant companions, following me wherever I went. The twins, Amanda and Amelia, and my youngest, Emily, are still that way. But Sarah, my oldest, was a different story. We used to be tight when she was a little girl, but when she hit 17, 18, she started acting out, putting more and more distance between us. From then on, she grew closer to her mother and farther from me, no matter how hard I tried to connect with her. As soon as I arrived home, I gave my daughters the news and went straight to see my beloved dogs. Soon after, my daughters arrived, and emotions were running high. We talked for hours, and I have to admit, tears were shed, a lot of them. We hugged each other tightly, and I was showered with kisses. They were all shocked at how their mother could have done something like that to me, and their perception of her had completely shifted. They continued to express their anger and frustration towards her, speaking about her in a very unflattering light. It was a jolt to my system, truth be told. Hearing my daughters talk like that about their mother made me feel deeply uneasy. In normal circumstances, I'd never let them speak of her that way. I was especially taken aback by Sarah's reaction. She used to be so close to her mother, but even though she saw the turmoil I was in, her response felt odd. Afterwards, we ordered dinner and had a pleasant meal together. We shared some laughs, and I decided to have a few drinks to take the edge off before turning in for the night. Unfortunately, I overdid it a bit and ended up passing out. I was woken up by Sarah, who said she was having trouble sleeping and asked if she could sleep with me that night. It was a surprise since she was all grown up and had moved on from sleeping with her dad. She was a sick kid when she was young, diagnosed with leukemia at the tender age of 3. Until she was 8 years old, she could only fall asleep with her head on my chest. I led her into bed and we snuggled up close, like when she was a kid. I was about to doze off when I noticed that she was crying. Sarah was having a panic attack, and she was mumbling in Portuguese, a habit that our family has when we're excited or emotional. She kept saying that everything was her fault and that she was sorry for hurting me. Eventually, the other girls woke up, and I was able to calm Sarah down. They all started talking in Portuguese, so I'll summarize what was said. Turns out, 7 months ago, my daughter Amelia caught my wife and my brother-in-law's brother red-handed. She came home early and found them in the middle of the act. My wife begged her not to tell anyone, but Amelia spilled the beans to Amanda, who then told Emily, and Emily told Anna. It seems like keeping a secret within the family is not their strong suit. Sarah decided to confront my wife about the affair, but my wife came up with all sorts of excuses and pleaded with Sarah to keep it a secret from me. Sarah eventually agreed and convinced her sisters to do the same. Unfortunately, my wife's lack of intelligence proved to be her undoing. Just 2 months later, Emily caught her and my brother-in-law's brother in the act, this time in my wife's car. And once again, the same scenario played out, with my wife begging our daughters to keep the affair a secret from me, insisting that she was weak and still loved me and couldn't bear to lose me. And once again, Sarah managed to convince the rest of the girls to keep quiet. By this point, everyone was crying and hugging me, with Sarah holding onto me so tightly that I thought my ribs might crack. As I reflected on everything that had happened, a sudden realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My wife's affair had been going on for almost a year, but why now? And then it dawned on me, it was all about money. My parents were loaded, while my wife's parents weren't exactly rolling in dough. And I, in my infinite wisdom, had spoiled our children rotten, even though my wife and I used to fight about it all the time. It seemed we had reached an agreement to not spoil them too much. 2020 was a year of surprises, and not in a good way. My wife went rogue and started doing things we had explicitly agreed not to do, like spoiling our kids. In June, she gifted Sarah a brand new car, not just any car, but a fancy Model S, without even discussing it with me. Then, 2 months ago, my wife bought an apartment for the twins in Boston, claiming that dorm life was too stressful for them. Again, without talking to me first. The issue was not the money. We are both successful and wealthy, but the fact that she was going against our agreement. It caused some heated arguments between us, but she always used the same excuse. 2020 was tough on them. I confronted them directly, asking if the only reason their mother was giving them all these lavish gifts was to buy their silence. They didn't respond, not a word. The words stung like a knife in the gut. "We didn't want to hurt you." That's all my daughters had to say about the matter. I could feel the anger boiling up inside me, a fire that threatened to consume me whole. Without thinking, I yelled at them to get out of my sight. It was harsh, but I needed space to process what had just happened. With a heavy heart, I began to pack my belongings. I grabbed my loyal dogs and we drove off into the night, headed for my ranch in Marshall. The drive was a blur, my mind consumed with thoughts of betrayal and anger. Looking back, it's a wonder I made it there alive, considering I wasn't even close to sober. Finally, I arrived at my destination, a place of solitude and reflection. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing mind. But how could I? My world had just shattered into a million pieces, and I was left to pick up the broken fragments on my own. Christmas was fast approaching, and I was facing the prospect of spending it alone for the first time in 46 years. But then, a new friend came into my life, a bottle of Blue Label. We had never met before, but as the days passed, we bonded over the holiday season. I was a wreck, a complete and utter mess. The emotions were too much to bear, and I found myself crying more in those 5 days than I ever had in my entire life. It wasn't a pretty sight, but the bottle of Blue Label was there for me, like a loyal companion. The only thing that kept me sane during those days was my furry companions, my dogs. I was in a daze, didn't know which way was up. I kept asking myself, what do I do now? Where do I go from here? My mind kept going back to my parents' house. It had been a while since I last visited them. Memories of my mom flooded my mind. She was taken from us so suddenly. I can still remember that day like it was yesterday. My heart ached just thinking about it, and my dad, he fought a brave battle with his illness, but in the end he couldn't hold on any longer. He passed away just 4 months after my mom. My mother had expressed her wish to be buried in her hometown in Brazil, and my father had the same desire, so I laid them to rest there. But it was a torturous experience, to say the least. I was so close to my parents, and now I had no place to go and talk to them, to feel their presence, as fate would have it. I held a Brazilian citizenship by virtue of my parents' place of birth. After taking a COVID test, which surprisingly returned negative, I bought a plane ticket and embarked on a 13-hour journey to Brazil. 8 hours later, I arrived in the small city where my parents were buried. The population was less than 20,000, so I easily found their graves. As the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, I poured myself a generous serving of scotch and raised a glass to my parents. I spent the night drinking and reminiscing about the good old days. Strangely, I could almost feel my dad's disappointment emanating from beyond the grave. The whole experience was unnerving, but it made me realize how much I missed him. Here's the latest scoop, folks. My phone's been ringing off the hook with calls and texts from everyone and their grandma, but I ain't giving it the time of day. I'm done with it all. As for what's next, well, I'm just taking it one day at a time, wallowing in my own misery. That's my plan, or lack thereof. Happy freaking New Year. Story 2. During the closeness with my wife, she called out another man's name. When I confronted her about it, she claimed that it was just a friend of hers. When I asked her who this mystery guy was, she told me it was just a friend of hers, but something didn't feel right. So I did some digging and found out that she had been exchanging messages with him. When I confronted her about it, she tried to downplay the whole thing, saying that it was blown out of proportion. She did admit to drinking and approaching the guy, but claimed that it was deeper than what was in the messages. Apparently, she was upset seeing happy couples together at a party we couldn't attend because of my work schedule, and she knew I was working hard to pay our bills and save for our future. As the story goes, My wife claimed to have spotted her colleague, James, smoking and suddenly felt a strong urge to join him. Now, I don't mind her smoking. It's perfectly legal where we live, but she's never really been a smoker before, so I can't help but wonder what could have possibly motivated her to go over and strike up a conversation with him. She came clean about telling him about her frustrations in bed life. I can't deny that closeness takes a back seat because of my exhausting work schedule, and when we do have it, it's pretty standard as she's unwell, and I'm not that adventurous, something I was completely unaware of until now. Apparently, he then asked her to join him upstairs. She got up to go. She claims she didn't intend to do anything inappropriate with him but wanted to have a private chat, but then felt dizzy and began to fall. As she told me her story, I couldn't help but feel like there were some gaps in her tale. She confessed that this guy James caught her when she almost fell down, but then suddenly they were kissing? That didn't sit well with me. According to her, she felt guilty after a few seconds and told him she wasn't comfortable with it. I raised an eyebrow at her timeline, but she quickly corrected herself and said it was only a few seconds, not minutes, as she had initially claimed. I'm not sure if I believe her or not. She went on to explain that she felt uncomfortable staying in the same room with James, so she found the homeowner and asked if she could lay down in a locked room with the purses. But that didn't make sense to me either. Why not just leave the party if she felt uncomfortable? She said she didn't want to leave because her friend, who was her ride, wasn't ready to go yet. Instead, she asked the homeowner to have someone come and get her when her friend was leaving. The more she spoke, the more I realized that her story was full of holes. But I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt for the time being and pressed her for more details. Supposedly, that's where the whole thing ended, and anything else this dude is spouting is hogwash, currently waiting on a response from her friend to confirm whether or not she was in that room at the end of the night, but I wouldn't put it past her girl power besties to cover for her. I told her I wanted to believe her version of events, that if it was just a kiss I could forgive it, even though it made me feel sick and betrayed. But something about the story didn't add up, like why she didn't want to report it to her bosses at work to protect her own reputation. I get it, but it still made me suspicious. It's not that I think she's a liar or a cheat, but I need some time to process everything. I didn't even know we had problems in our marriage serious enough for her to confide in a stranger about them. I suggested to her that we should go to couples counseling. She already sees a therapist on her own, but I'm not really sure what they discuss because she's not very forthcoming about it. She told me that she thinks couples counseling could help us, especially since most of her sessions with her current therapist revolve around her nightmares, panic attacks, and fear of passing. It's been almost a year since she started seeing that therapist, and she still wakes up in the middle of the night crying. I told her that I needed some time to think. Maybe it sounds a bit dramatic, but I took a sheet and hung it up in the living room to create a little private space behind it where I set up my computer. I need to be alone with my thoughts for a while. I'll give it a day or two to let everything sink in, and then I'll talk to her again after her appointment on Thursday. I don't know how long it'll take me to get over this, but every time I look at her, all I can think of is her vulnerable and wide-eyed in someone else's arms, and it just hurts. My mind's a mess. I'm thinking about finding a therapist for myself, someone who can help me cope with the imminent loss of my wife, the love of my life. I'm holed up in the living room, hiding behind a makeshift sheet barrier with my computer on the couch. I feel like a child playing fort. But this is the only thing that feels right to me at the moment. She tried to talk to me, to come out from my hiding place, but I just couldn't face her. I need time to process all of this, to sort out my emotions and figure out what to do next. I'm lost, desperate for some guidance. If anyone out there can offer any help, any advice, I would be grateful beyond measure. At around 7 p.m., I left the house and aimlessly walked until I found myself standing in front of the liquor store. I ended up purchasing an average-sized bottle of tequila, and before I knew it, I'd already consumed a significant amount of it. Drinking isn't my usual go-to, and since I'm quite slim, I was quickly feeling the effects of the alcohol. By 9 p.m., I had stumbled back to the house and attempted to confront her. I was irate and inebriated, and in a moment of anger, I gave her a gentle shove. To my surprise, She responded by telling me to do it again, claiming that she wanted me to be mad. So I gave her another push, and she attempted to kiss me and touch me, which led to us engaging in some acts. The situation was consensual, but I wasn't comfortable with it. I only went along with it because it had been so long since she showed any interest. About 25 minutes into the act, she said the name James X. I asked her what the heck was going on, and she looked at me and said, "I guess he made me say it so much I forgot. I'm currently holed up in my own little world. Tomorrow, I plan to tell her to leave. I know I'll be all right without her, and she'll be fine without me." I was abruptly awakened at 4 a.m. by a pungent odor of marijuana wafting through the apartment. My mind was foggy, but I had a sinking feeling that something was wrong. I stumbled towards the bedroom, hoping against hope that my wife hadn't been foolish enough to bring that man back to our home. But as I entered the room, I found that most of her things, including her medications, clothes, TV, and computer, were gone. I desperately hoped that she had packed up and left on her own accord, but deep down, I knew that the reality was far from that. I marched down to the apartment office as soon as it opened and demanded to change the locks. She wasn't on the lease, and I wasn't going to tolerate her popping up unannounced to stir up drama. The office agreed, and I felt a sense of relief, knowing she couldn't just waltz in anymore. I texted her, telling her she could retrieve her belongings with the presence of her brothers or a mutual friend, but under no circumstances was that guy allowed in my apartment. Her response, the laughing so hard you're crying emoji, typical. I can't even deal with her immaturity right now. I made my way down to the apartment office as soon as it opened, ready to discuss changing the locks. I explained to the staff that she wasn't on the lease and I didn't want any trouble if she came back to cause problems. Afterward, I sent her a text message stating that when she comes to pick up her belongings, she should bring one of her brothers or anyone else but the guy in question. I made it clear that I don't want him anywhere near my property. However, her response was a laughing so hard you're crying emoji. It's as if she doesn't understand the gravity of the situation, and it makes me question if she's taking this seriously at all. As I reflect on last night, I'm starting to wonder if she's experiencing some kind of breakdown. Looking back, everything seemed so deliberate. It doesn't make sense to say someone's first and last name during closeness unless you're either weird or you want to make sure your boyfriend knows you said someone else's name and didn't just mishear his own. I picked up the phone and dialed my boss's number. He was surprisingly supportive of my decision and advised me to take some time off to clear my head. He even gave me a few days off, telling me that my job will still be there when I'm ready to return. It's been months since I've had 2 consecutive days off, let alone 4. Going back to a life that doesn't revolve around her will be a challenge. I'm not even sure if I remember how to have fun anymore, but I'm optimistic that I'll find my way back to happiness. I've got to say, the fund was a smart move on my part. It's almost entirely my hard-earned cash, maybe even all of it. But I'm not letting that go to waste. If things go smoothly and she collects her things without a fuss, I'm planning on giving her around $500 out of it as a parting gift. After all, it was meant for her, right? But the rest of that sweet stash is all mine. Baby, I might even treat myself to a little getaway using some of my vacation time. Time to leave all this drama behind and live a little. I'm not really worried about her. She's posted some vague messages on social media about how she thought her loved ones would be there for her during tough times. It's already filled with likes, sad emojis, and comments like, "Message me, girl," so she's getting all the support she needs. My mind is still reeling, and I'm trying to process everything that's happened. It may sound a bit over the top, but I'm seriously considering seeking counseling. I feel hurt and violated, and I don't think I can come to terms with it all on my own.